Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to be going through loads of information about watercolours and how I create my watercolour paintings. I'm going to be talking about the materials I use, key techniques and lots of other stuff. So let's get straight into it with the materials that I like to use. So first of all, let's talk about the paint, and you can get watercolour paint in two different types. You can get it in the pans like I've got here, but you can also get it in tubes, and neither option is better than the other. It is just down to preference. I prefer pans like this because of the fact that they're easier to travel with, and also I find that you get less wastage with the pans because you just mix what you need. Whereas with tubes, you can mix a larger quantity of paint at any one time, which is great if you're covering a large area, but you might find that you get a bit more wastage. Now let's discuss the paper, and paper is really important. You want to make sure that you're getting a paper that's thick enough to cope with the amount of paint and water that you're going to apply to the surface. So really look at the thickness of the paper you're buying and make sure it's a watercolour paper. I like to use two different ones. I like to use the Arches cold press paper, which has a lot more texture, and the hot press paper, which is a lot smoother. I like to use my cold press paper for my watercolour animal work, and I use my hot press paper for my realistic work instead. The next supply you'll need for your watercolour paintings is a water jar, and I just use an old food jar. I take the label off it and it works great for me, but I have a tip for you guys. Instead of using one jar, why not try using two? And basically you swill off the brush with the first jar and that gets rid of most of the colour, and then you give it a final swirl around in the second jar, and as you can see the second jar stays a lot cleaner, and so this will save you from having to keep going and changing your water. Moving on to the brushes that I use for my watercolour work, I like to mainly use my silver black velvet brushes, and I just get them in a few different sizes. You don't have to go mad and buy loads and loads of brushes. I also like to use water brush pens, and these are great because you can fill them with water inside this little pen and the water will come through into the bristles. And this is great if you want to have more control over the amount of water you're applying to your paint, and it's also great for getting cool gradient effects as well. Another thing that you're going to need when you're using watercolours is some palettes to mix your colours on, and these don't have to be really expensive. You can get them really cheap. I think these were like £1 or £2 each, so they don't have to be expensive, or you could just use something like a plate to mix your colours on. Also, if you're using paints in pans, then most of the time the actual tin will have an area to mix your colours on as well. Another supply which is really handy to have is some gouache, and I just use the white gouache, and I use this for highlights. It's not essential, but it is really great for getting those bright highlights. Other things that you can use with your watercolour work is inks. I like to use gold ink, but you can get loads of different types of inks to use with your watercolours. For more detailed highlights, I like to go in with a white gel pen, and I use the Sakura Jelly Roll gel pen. I will be listing all of the materials that I'm using in the description below if you want to check them out. And so like I said, I just use this for any detailed highlights that I want to add to my watercolour work. After it is dry, it's normally the last step that I go in and do. Before I start my watercolour paintings, I like to go in with some Scotch tape, and I use this to tape down the borders. A few other things that I like to use are pipettes. I think you can get really cool effects with this, which I'll show you guys later. I'm also going to be using salt in this tutorial when I go through some key techniques, and also some cling film. So that is it for all of the materials, and now let's move on to the key techniques. Before I actually go in with the watercolour paint, I do like to go in and do a pencil sketch first. But you don't want your sketch to be too dark, otherwise the graphite will show through the watercolours. So the first thing that I do is I take a kneaded eraser and I just go over the pencil sketch just to lighten it up and remove any of the excess graphite. The first technique that I actually want to talk about is the wet in wet method, and this is the technique that I use the most. And what it basically means is you pre-wet the surface of your paper with just water, and because you have a wet surface, when you add the paints, they can nicely bleed into each other, and this is great if you don't want to have any harsh edges in your watercolour work. So for example, if you were doing realistic studies and you don't want to have harsh edges, or if you just want a soft value change, a nice gradient, or if you just want to have a nice blurry background or something, then the wet in wet method will be great for you. So just lightly go in and wet the surface. Don't use too much water. It's really important that you control the amount of water that you're applying to the paper. The more water you actually apply down, the more your colours are going to bleed and the less control you're going to have of the paint. If you just add a light layer of water, however, then it won't bleed out as much, but you will have more control of where the paint goes. So just add enough water so that the paper is nicely glistening, but you don't want to have actual puddles of water forming. If you have got that, then you've probably added too much water. When I use this technique when I'm doing my loose animal watercolours, I do like to have some harsh edges, so I tend just to wet a certain area at a time, and so I will have harsher edges around the outside, but where I have actually applied that water, I will have a nice bled out look where I apply the different colours. Whereas when I'm doing something more realistically, like this mouth study, I will wet the entire area and keep the entire painting wet and work on it whilst it's wet. You will have to work fairly quickly. You don't need to rush it, but you do have to work quick in order to keep everything wet and make sure that you're applying the paint before the layer dries out. If you're finding that the area is drying, then just let it dry and then re-wet the whole surface and apply another layer. Most of the time with watercolor work, you're going to have to work in several layers. You can't just get it done in one layer, but make sure you're letting your paintings dry between each layer. When I'm doing backgrounds for my loose animal watercolours, I do tend to add a bit more water so that the colours really do bleed into each other, and then I just go in and drop in lots of different colours. I splatter some colours down as well, and as you can see, they really do bleed into each other. I also build up from like lighter colours to darker, more intense colours as well. It's important to have a nice contrast with your work as well. When I'm adding details to my painting, I won't want the painting to be wet, otherwise you'll get a bled out look and they won't be very crisp. So if you add details, do this when the painting is dry. Now, a really fun thing to use with watercolor work is salt. You can get some really pretty and cool sort of effects with salt. So here I'm going to be showing you a few different swatches of paint, and when you're using the salt, you don't want your painting to be too wet. If you have puddles of water, then it won't really work, and if your painting is too dry, again, it won't really work. So make sure that it's just wet enough but not too wet, and if you do it right, then you'll get some really beautiful effects, as you can see here. Mostly I use this if I'm doing like a snowy landscape or winter sort of scene. I think it's really cool for that, but I also use it for my expressive animal watercolors because it just gives some cool textures and different effects, and it will just make your paintings look a bit more interesting. Another household supply which is really fun to use with watercolours is cling film. So you probably have this already, and particularly this is great to use if you're drawing something like flowers or plants because you can use it for the stems, or it even gives like a really cool like ice effect if you use it on blue watercolours. And so what you basically do is just cut off a bit of the cling film and you lay it over the watercolours and you just pull it into place until you get an effect that you're happy with. And when I peel it off, you'll see that where it's kind of lifted up slightly from the paper, it gives more lighter effects, and you get just a stunning effect, which again you can use it with your expressive watercolors just to add a bit of interest and a cool effect, or you could use it for something like ice or stems of a plant. Now you might want to create highlights with your paint or lift up watercolor, and the first way that I like to do this is with a clean, just damp brush. So wash out your brush, make sure it's still nice and damp, don't dry it too much, and whilst your watercolour is still wet, you'll be able to lift up some of that paint to give you a nice highlighted look, just to lift the colour off a bit so it'll give a slightly lighter value. As you can see, I'm applying this technique to my pig painting, and I'm just doing this in an area where the colour probably got a bit too dark and I just wanted to add a bit more of a highlight to it. And as you can see, it really does lift off the colour wow. Another technique that I often use is actually adding water drops to my painting. So here you can see I'm applying it with a pipette. You're probably wondering earlier, what am I going to use this pipette for? But as you can see, it does give a really cool effect. Or I just go in with my paintbrush and I just splatter on water just onto my watercolor painting. And adding like water drops in between, say, the purple paint, you can see it adds lighter values and little like starry sort of patterns. And it's really cool tool. And again, if you're doing something expressive, then having all of these little techniques going on is really just going to bring your painting up to the next level. When it comes to using gouache, you can use it when the watercolours are wet and also when the watercolours have dried. So firstly, you're going to see me using the gouache when the watercolours are wet. Firstly, I'm just splattering the gouache into the wet watercolour, and as you can see, it works like the watercolours. It bleeds into the wet watercolours just as well, but because the gouache is thicker, it's more opaque, it gives more of like a creamier finish. And so this would be really good to use if you're painting something like clouds, because as you can see, it would give a really nice fluffy effect to it. You can also use gouache, like I said, when the watercolour is already dried. And this is how I mainly like to use it, because I like to use it for highlights. And you can see that it completely covers up the watercolour. The more water you add to your gouache, the more translucent the effect is going to be. And obviously, the less water you add, the thicker and more opaque it's going to be. I also use the gouache to add some splatters as well. So far, I've shown you a few different ways how you can lift the paint by using a clean wet brush, and also how you can add highlights with the gouache. But another way you can add highlights is using a tissue, and you can use this to dab up the wet watercolour. And again, this could be used for something like painting clouds. And you can use the tissue if you make a mistake and you want to lift up the watercolour completely, or just to create some interesting effects like clouds. Another key thing that I like to do for my watercolour work is add splatters. And to do this, I just load my paintbrush up with paint and I tap the brush. So as you can see, I tap it and I flick it. The bigger your paintbrush is, the bigger sort of splatter drops you're going to get. And if you're using a really small paintbrush, then you're going to get really small paint splatters. With one watercolour, you can get lots of different values, because with watercolours you add water. So the more water you add, the more translucent and pale the colour is going to be, and the less water you add, so the more concentrated the paint is, the darker it's going to be. So when you're mixing your colours, think about what value you want it to be. If you need it to be slightly lighter, then add a little more water to it. Now I want to give you guys a tip. When I'm actually drying my different layers of watercolour, I like to use a hairdryer to actually speed up the process. The third section that I want to talk to you guys about is how to actually pick the right colours for your artwork. It can be really difficult and frustrating to know which colours work well together. So for this, we need to look at the colour wheel. And so there's two different things that I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, complementary colours, and secondly, harmonious colours. Let's start off with complementary colours. So if you want to create a lot of contrast in your work, then you want to be using complementary colours. And what they basically are colours that are opposite to each other in the colour wheel. So for example, yellow is opposite to purple, orange is opposite to blue, and red is opposite to green. So these are three sets of complementary colours. And when you use a set of complementary colours together, then it will really make the painting pop. And now the second type of colours are harmonious colours. And so harmonious colours are colours that are actually next to each other in the colour wheel. So for example, if you were using yellow, then you might also want to mix that with orange and red. If you're using pink, then you might also add purples and blues. And so they are colours next to each other in the colour wheel. If you're using yellow, you might also go the other way and use green with it, and also blue next to the green as well. When I use watercolours, I like to use complementary colours and harmonious colours together in one piece. When I'm using black for my watercolours, I do tend to like to use purples and blues with the black. Now, if you're using complementary colours, one thing that you don't want to do is use them in the same area, because even though they're great to use them together, if you use them in the same area, you can see that adding the green on top of the red really just gives a dull, dark brown, disgusting, dull colour. And it definitely isn't that green that I'm applying down, because that's a very nice, vibrant green. And when you use complementary colours in the same area, they cancel each other out and give a really dull appearance. So what you do want to do is use complementary colours, but in totally different areas. For this lion painting, you can see that the main colours I'm using are yellow and purple. But in the yellow areas, I'm also using splashes of orange and red, which are harmonious colours to the yellow. And where I'm using purple, I'm also using pinks and blues. And as you can see with the blacks, I'm also using purples and blues. So you can see how I'm using complementary colours, but also harmonious colours as well. Also with this elephant painting where I'm applying the black, I tend to use purples and blues as well. I don't really just use one colour in one area, I do like to add splashes of other colours. Don't feel like when you're using watercolours you just have to stick to using watercolours. I have found that it's really fun to actually incorporate other mediums into my watercolour work, and there are lots of great mediums that work fantastically with watercolours. So the first one that I actually want to talk to you guys about is fine liners, and fine liners are probably the medium that I use the most with my watercolours because of the fact that they are really good for adding like little outlines or giving more of an illustrative look to my watercolor animal paintings. So I like to use the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pens, and I've got them in a variety of different sizes, and you can see that on top of this dry watercolor the fine liner goes on top really nicely and really crisp. It gives a really crisp finish. And so like I said, I do use it mostly with my animal watercolors. So here I have got a bird painting that I did recently, and I'm just going in with a small fine liner, and I just use this to add a bit of clarity to some of the edges, make them a bit more crisp and defined, add a bit more definition. I've already mentioned the next medium in the video, and that is gel pens. Like I said before, I love adding gel pens just for details and highlights, but I don't really use this too much. I much prefer to use my gouache, but like I said, it is great if you want to add little decorative sort of patterns to your watercolors, and also if you want to get really detailed sort of highlights that is hard to do with your gouache. The next medium that I'm going to be talking about is another one that I use a lot with my watercolor work, and that is colored pencils. Colored pencils are great for adding details and adding a bit of definition to your work. You can use any colored pencils you want, and I just like to go in and add details with them. And another great sort of purpose they have is also making any colors a bit more vibrant. So for example, with this pink, if I wanted to make it a little bit more saturated and darker, I could just go in with a coloured pencil. So I did use the coloured pencils quite a lot for this mouth painting. So I just went in with the watercolours first, and once that had all dried, I went in with the coloured pencils to add the little cracks in the lips and also to darken up any values that I needed to, and I used some solvent over the top just to sort of fuse all of those colours together. Another medium you can use on top of your watercolours are pastels. So you use these once the watercolour is dry, you use them on top of the watercolours, and again you can use these to add details. And because the pastels blend really softly, this would be great if you wanted to make a colour a bit more vibrant because they blend really softly as well. Anyway guys, that is it for today's video. If you want to follow along with me in real time as I create these paintings and learn all of my techniques, then I have got these available on my Patreon in real time so you can follow along with me. I've also got over 200 real-time tutorials on there now for you guys in lots of different mediums. Anyway guys, that is it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and let me know if these tips helped you. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here for more tips and tutorial videos. But I'll see you guys in the next one.